Nobody wanted the shop. That was the point of leaving it to her. At 71, Eleanor Harmon Nell, to the town of Hadwin, Connecticut, and to no one anymore at home, sat in a lawyer's office that smelled of radiator dust and cold coffee and listened to a stranger read out the division of 29 years of her life, and when it was finished, her husband's 2 children had the house, the money, and the good brick building on Main Street, and Nell had a leaning clapboard clock shop at the end of Mill Lane, and whatever broken time was piled inside it. Ray made a sound when she signed for it, a short breath through the nose that in a kinder man would have been a laugh, and in Ray was only arithmetic. Paula studied the middle distance, and Nell, who had buried Amos Harmon 9 days before and had not yet let herself cry where the family could measure it, folded her copy of the deed into her handbag and thanked them, quietly, for driving her home. What none of them knew, not Ray, not Paula, not the neighbors who shook their heads at the meanness of it, not Nell herself. Walking down Mill Lane that evening toward the black little building the whole town called a firetrap, was that behind a locked door at the back of that shop, wound and oiled and patient, stood the finest thing anyone in that family had ever owned. Amos had spent 30 years putting it there. He had known exactly what his children would take and exactly what they would step over, and he had built his wife's inheritance in the one room he could be certain none of them would ever trouble to enter. This is the story of what Nell Harmon found when she finally went into the back room. It had been a small funeral, the way late October funerals are in that part of the Naugatuck Valley, where the hills were already going rust, and the light came thin and early through the meeting house windows. Amos Harmon was 78 when his heart quit in the front room of the shop, in the chair at his bench, with a stopped pocket watch open under his loop, and the town clock still keeping his time in the church tower up the hill. The meeting house filled with the people a man collects in a lifetime of mending things, farmers whose grandfather clocks he had coaxed back to life, and women who had brought him watches that had stopped the day a husband died, and could not say why it mattered so much that they run again. Nell sat in the front pew between Amos's children, because that was where the funeral director placed her. Ray, 56, wore the blazer he wore to closings. He brokered commercial buildings 2 counties wide and had his father's straight back and none of his father's stillness. Paula, 53, had flown up from Charlotte and kept her sunglasses on inside the church. They were not cruel, Nell would have told you then. They were only people who had decided, 29 years earlier, that the piano teacher their father married in his 50s was a footnote that did not concern them. At the reception in the parish hall, Nell overheard Paula tell a cousin that at least the estate was simple. She said it the way you'd say the weather had held. The will was read on the 2nd Thursday of November in the office of Silas Pruitt, who had drawn Amos Harmon's papers for 40 years and who did not smile that morning, though he looked at Nell more than once with an expression she was too tired to open. The house on Chapel Street and everything in it went to Ray and Paula, share and share alike. The brick building on Main Street, where Amos had kept his counter and his good custom for 30 years, went to Ray and Paula. The accounts, the certificates, the truck, Ray and Paula. And then Pruitt cleared his throat and read the clause that made Ray sit forward, a man recognizing a joke a beat before he decides whether to be amused by it. To my wife, Eleanor, the old shop building at the end of Mill Lane, the land beneath it, and each and every item of its contents, of whatever kind and value, absolutely and without condition. That was the whole of it. No money, no share of the Main Street rents, a fire trap on a back lane with a stopped clock painted over the door, a cellar that took water, and whatever 30 years of tired movements and orphan parts had silted up inside. Paula said, into the quiet, that Daddy always did keep his sense of humor to the end. Pruitt looked down at his papers and said the language was exactly as Mr. Harmon had instructed it, word for word, and that he had declined to soften a syllable of it, though the will had been revised as recently as 3 years back. Nobody asked what that meant. Nell signed where the little tabs pointed, and 29 years were done in half an hour, handed off like the wrong coat at the end of a party. She could have contested it. The women from the church told her so in the gentle, relentless way of women who have watched too many widows go quietly. There were spousal shares, elective rights, a firm in Waterbury that did nothing else. Nell listened and thanked them and did not telephone the firm in Waterbury. Some of it was pride, the narrow, load-bearing pride of a woman who had come into that family with a secondhand upright piano and $11 in a Christmas Club account, and would not go out of it holding her hand open. But underneath, it was something steadier. Amos had written that will himself, in his own careful hand at the kitchen table. And in 29 years, Amos Harmon had never once done a careless thing to her. He was a man who set 2 alarms for a 5 o'clock train and woke before either one rang. Whatever this was, and standing at the end of Mill Lane that November, looking at the shop's black bulk against a bruised sky, she could not for her life see what it was. It was not carelessness. She had a widow's benefit, a teacher's small pension, a paid-off car, and a building that took water. It would have to serve, because it was what he had left her, and she had decided, on no evidence a lawyer would credit, to trust him one more time. Ray gave her until the 1st of December to be clear of the house on Chapel Street, and said she was welcome to her personal things, leaning on the word the way you lean on a door you would rather have shut. Robin came the last day to help her move. Ray's daughter, 28, the only Harmon who had ever sat at Nell's kitchen table without being sent to fetch something. Robin carried the little uprights bench down the porch steps, holding it against her like a child, and was angrier than Nell permitted herself to be. Angry in the fluent, unembarrassed way of the young, saying it was a disgrace, saying Nell should get a lawyer and burn the whole thing down around them. Nell told her to mind the ice on the second step. The shop had a front room with the bench and the counter, a back room she had never once been into in 29 years, and a loft of pigeon, haunted rafters. And it had not been given a proper sweeping, from the look of it, in 20 years. They worked 2 days getting the front room fit to stand in, carried out the rotten matting, blacked the little stove, tacked plastic over the window that faced the mill race. When they were done, Robin stood in the doorway, looking down the shelves of stopped clocks, hundreds of them, faces blank as a jury, and asked what on earth Nell meant to do with all of it. Nell looked a long moment at the ranks of stilled hands. "Set it running," she said. "Finally, it's mine now. I'd like to know what time it keeps." She had come into that family in the fall of 1987 with a piano and a hope she had been too old, even then, to say out loud. Nell Ballard, 42, renting 3 rooms over the pharmacy, teaching the town's children their scales, and taking in the tuning nobody else would drive out for. Amos Harmon, 49, 7 years a widower, keeping his shop and his 2 half-grown children and a silence you could have set your watch by. He courted her the way he did everything, slowly and without waste, and she had loved him for 29 years in that same economy of speech. The children never warmed, not with open cruelty, mostly, but with weather. Ray called her Nell in a tone that fixed, to the inch, the distance between Nell and Mother, and the music she tried to send into that family, years of free lessons and Christmas Eve carols played until her hands ached, was received, and thanked for, and forgotten by New Year's. A teacher learns early that you give the lesson and let the child carry it off wherever they will, or you go bitter, and Nell had made her choice a long time ago. What she did not know, all those years among people who spoke around her, was that one man at the table had been keeping the account. Amos never said. Amos, she would come to understand, believed that saying was cheap and that keeping was the only proof that counted. The shop was older than the marriage, older than the paved road. Amos's grandfather had opened it in 1911, when Hadwin still turned out cheap shelf clocks by the gross for the peddlers, and the trade had gone out around it slowly, the way a spring runs down, until Amos was the last man in 3 towns who could put a sick movement back in beat. From Mill Lane, the building looked exactly like what the town said it was. Black clapboards curled like old bark, a sign over the door where a painted clock had faded to a ghost of itself, its hands stopped forever at some hour no one living remembered. Moss on the north sill. A cellar you could hear the mill race running in. The front room was a cave of stilled time, a wall of tall case hoods and shelf clocks, waiting on repairs their owners had died before collecting. Drawers of hands and pinions and mainsprings coiled like sleeping things. A bench black with a century of clock oil, and hanging from the beams the whole vocabulary of a vanished trade. Bluing pans and depthing tools and a regulator with a mercury pendulum, gone to tarnish. Junk, Ray had called it at the diner, and standing in the door that first cold morning, with a broom in her hand and the low sun coming level down the lane, Nell could not honestly have argued the point. But it was quiet in there. Quiet the way the inside of a stopped clock is quiet, and it smelled of oil and brass and old wood, of years, and it did not once look at her with pity, which was more than she could say for the parish hall. She set the broom to the corner nearest the stove and began. She went at it the way she had taught the hard sonatas, which was the way she did everything. Hands separate, slowly, one measure at a time, until the difficult passage stopped being difficult and became a thing the fingers simply knew. Mornings she sorted and carried, afternoons she cleaned and made her lists. A junk man from the county road took the sprung springs and the hopeless cases, and left her $40 she was glad to have. The bench cleaned up better than she expected. Under the oil the wood was cherry, worn to a pale hollow at the front edge by 30 years of leaning close over the work. She found swallows' nests in the loft and left them, a cigar box of watch keys, a child's mitten stiff as a chestnut behind a radiator, the sediment of a working life, hers now by marriage and not by blood, and she handled all of it more gently than any of them would have believed. The neighbors slowed their cars on Mill Lane to watch the widow sweep out her insult, and some of them lifted a hand. She learned later that Ray had told a table at the diner that the old girl was welcome to every last cog of it, and that the kindest thing said in reply was nothing at all. By the middle of December, the front room had become, against all expectation, including her own, a place she was glad to walk into. She caulked the window seams and hung a curtain sewn from a length of ticking she had been saving 20 years for nothing in particular. One raw afternoon she took down the nearest of the stopped shelf clocks, a plain 30-hour with a broken verge, and because her father had shown her once, 60 years gone, how to let a mainspring down without losing a finger, she had it ticking before dark, and sat and listened to it the way you listen to a voice you had forgotten you missed. The guild came out on a Tuesday with a hot dish and appraising eyes, 6 women who had known her since she first played for their weddings, and by the second pot of coffee they had decided against pitying her. Because Nell was not pitiful, she was busy, and there is no arguing with a busy woman. That night she wound the little clock and set it on the shelf beside the cold back-room door she had not yet opened, and lay on her cot and listened to it keep time in the dark, and found she could not always hold on to the anger she was fully owed. By the new year she had caught herself, twice, calling the shop something other than a firetrap. She had caught herself calling it the shop, the way you say a thing that is yours. The first strange thing was the tower. A man named Elias Frost, who had been sexton at the Congregational Church for 40 years and had a face like the underside of a bell, stopped his truck on Mill Lane one December morning to tell her that if she ever meant to sell the old regulator off the shop wall, he'd give her a fair price, and, while he was standing there, said the other thing. Somebody'd been keeping the town clock, he said, all these years. The selectmen thought it ran itself, the way people think a thing runs itself when a man is quietly running it. But the truth was, Amos had climbed the tower the first Monday of every month for 30 years, in every weather, to wind the weights and clean the escapement and set the beat by the star he trusted, and had never taken $1 for it, and had asked Elias, more than once, not to make a business of mentioning it. Elias, being Elias, hadn't, until now when it no longer seemed to cost anybody anything. Nell stood in the cold of the lane after his truck had gone, looking up the hill to where the 4 white faces of the town clock told the same time to every street in Hadwin, and felt something turn over slowly under her ribs, like the first true stroke of a clock that has just been set going. Amos had been keeping the town's time. For 30 years, unpaid, unmentioned, he had climbed a tower in the dark so that no one in Hadwin would ever look up at a stopped clock and feel what a stopped clock makes a person feel. She had married him and buried him and had not known. The second strange thing was the key. She found it in January, in the knee-hole of the old roll-top desk in the front room, taped to the underside of the center drawer, where a hand had to go looking for it on purpose. A small flat key, older than the desk, and taped beside it in a fold of soft yellow chamois. A single slip of paper in the small, careful hand she had read on 30 years of repair tickets and Christmas tags. It did not say what the key opened. It said only, "Wind it first, Nell." She sat down in Amos's chair with the key in her palm and the note on her knee and did not move for a long while. Amos did not tape notes to the bottoms of drawers. Amos said what he had to say at the supper table in 9 words, and considered the matter closed. Somebody had hidden this key the way you hide a thing you mean to be found by one particular person, the kind who would notice that the cloth was a watchmaker's chamois folded soft, and understand that "wind it first" was not an instruction about a key at all. The key, she saw now, was small and square-shanked, the kind that turns a cabinet or a case, and not a door. She had spent 6 weeks not opening the one locked door in the building, the back room she had told herself she would come to when the front was done. She turned the key over once more, and put on her coat against the cold of that room, and went to find the locket fit. The back room was not what the front room had led her to expect. Where the front was chaos schooled into order, the back was simply order. A long, dry, cold chamber under the tight part of the roof, its one window shuttered, its walls lined floor to ceiling with clocks she had never seen, 30 and more of them, each standing or hanging under a cover of muslin and soft cloth, and not a speck of the front room's dust on any of them. It was the tidiest room she had ever stood in, and the stillest 30 quiet hearts under sheets, and in the center of it, on a plain table with a good lamp, lay a ledger. A gray cloth-bound account book, its corners gone round with handling, its spine soft, the kind sold in every stationer's in the country in 1985. And when she opened it under the lamp, she did not at first understand what she was reading, because it looked like a repair log, and Amos logged everything. Dates, names, sums. The first entry was dated in the spring of 1986, a year before he had ever spoken to her after choir, and it read, Number 1. Ballard Mantel Clock, Rosewood, 8-day, strike, Corliss Sale Room, Waterbury. It was her mother's, sold in the bad year when the girl was left alone. She thinks it gone for good. The back room, top shelf, left. Nell read it twice. Ballard. Her own name, the one she had carried up to the age of 42. And the clock was her mother's clock, the Rosewood 8-day whose single chime had been the sound of her whole girlhood, sold in the black year after her mother died, when she was young and alone, and the rent fell due, and here it was, bought back at a sale room by a quiet widower a year before he first spoke to her, of all things, about a metronome that would not keep true. He had never told her. 29 years, and he had never once told her that he was the man at the back of that sale room, that he had bought a piece of her before he had learned her name. She held the ledger to her chest in the cold and cried the way she had not cried at the grave, and above her the 30 covered clocks kept their silence. And that was only entry number 1. There were 30 more. She read the rest of it that night in the front room by the stove, with the little 30-hour ticking on the shelf, and it was like sitting across a table from a man confessing to a lifetime of a gentleness he had never once let anyone catch him at. Entry after entry, year over year, in the same small hand. Number 4. Terry Pillar and Scroll, Wood Movement, 1822, off a barn floor in Plymouth. The seller thought the works were kindling, $30. Number 9. Tall Clock, Cherry Case, Brass Movement, Simon Willard School, found doing duty as a coat cupboard in a church annex. They had bored a row of hooks through the door of it. $200 and a week before I breathed right. Number 19. Schoolhouse regulator out of the old Hadwin Grammar building. When they pulled it down, nobody on the crew would say what became of the children's clock. So I asked, and paid the foreman $40, and now it is safe. On, 30 years of it, sale rooms and rag-outs and cellar holes across the valley. Good American clocks bought for the price of a supper, because the world had decided the people who made them and kept them were nobody, and every entry closed the same way. The same terse bearing repeated like a man counting his steps in a dark stairwell, the back room, and a shelf, and a side. And threaded among the numbers, rarer, were the lines that were not bookkeeping at all. Under number 9, the Willard School Tall Clock, a year of some vanished joiners' evenings in this case, and they hung their coats in it. That is the whole sickness of the world in one sentence. Under number 17, N. Asked tonight why my good coat smelled of cedar and machine oil. Told her the shop. First lie in 11 years, and it was to keep a secret that was hers. Under number 22, the year Amos turned 75, told Elias the tower is his after me, and showed him the beat. A man should not be the only one alive who knows how the town keeps time. Nell sat with her thumb on that line a long while. She thought of the 30 years of small absences she had never questioned. The Saturday sales, he said, were for parts, and came home from with parts. Because he was honest, the smell of cedar and oil in his good coat, the way he would stand in the door of the front room some evenings and watch her play the church's old piano, with a look she had put down to a man being fond. He had not been being fond. He had been keeping a ledger. The last numbered entry was dated in September, a month before he died, and unlike all the rest, it named no price and no sale room. It read, number 31. Metronome, mahogany, pyramid, key wound. Hers, from the room over the pharmacy, she believes it went in a move. It keeps better time than I do now. And beneath it, alone at the foot of the page, in a hand gone smaller and less steady, it's the shop, Nell. It was always the shop. Wind the Ballard clock, and then come and find the rest of us. She did not read on. She went back into the cold of the back room with the lamp, and found it where the first entry said it would be, top shelf, left, under its muslin. A rosewood mantel clock with a painted glass tablet, 8 day. The case she would have known in the dark by the shape of the shadow it threw, because it had thrown that same shadow on the wall of her mother's parlor every night of her girlhood. She lifted it down with both hands. Behind the little door, taped inside the case, was its own winding key, and she did not need the note to tell her what to do, because a body remembers what the mind has grieved. She set the hands, and found the winding square, and wound the 8 day mainspring the number of turns her mother's wrist had taught hers before she was 10 years old, and started the pendulum with one finger, the way you push a child's swing, and stepped back. It caught. It found its beat, the small, steady 2-step of a clock that has somewhere to be, and on the half hour, while she was still standing there with her hand over her mouth, it gathered itself and struck once, a single soft note on a coiled wire. The exact voice of the front room of a house in which her mother was still alive, and it was not yet the black year, and nothing had yet been sold. Nell sat down on the cold floor of her husband's secret room, among 30 covered clocks, with her mother's clock keeping time above her for the first time in 50 years, and let the whole of it arrive at once. None of this was an accident. Not the shop, not the will, not the breath Ray let out through his nose. Her husband had left his children everything that could be counted, and left her the one thing that could not. It took her a fortnight to bring them all into the light, working alone, uncovering one at a time and setting each on the long table under the good lamp and checking it against the ledger, and the ledger was never once wrong. The Terry pillar and scroll with its wooden wheels, older than the town's own charter. The Willard School tall clock, cherry and brass, taller than she was, its slow moon rolling across a painted sky, a year of some vanished joiner's evenings, and they had bored it full of coat hooks. The schoolhouse regulator that had measured out the lessons of children who were grandparents now, a plain kitchen clock with a family's whole history penciled inside its door in 4 different hands. And the last of the numbered entries, the final handful, were not rare and not old, and not, to any auctioneer alive, worth the gas to come and look at them. Number 28. Alarm clock, tin from the 5 and dime, belonged to the Pease boy who mowed for us. He cried when the works broke, and his people could not spare another $1, mended, and kept against his coming back for it. Number 30. School bell, brass, hand-rung, from the grammar building, not a clock at all, but it kept a kind of time, and I could not watch it go into the skip. And number 31. The metronome. Hers, the mahogany pyramid that had stood on the pharmacy room piano the winter he first heard her play through an open window and decided, though he did not yet know her name, that whatever else he did with the rest of his life, he would not let that particular time be lost. Her things. The small discarded time of her own life, tracked down and mended and shelved among the masterpieces, because in Amos's ledger they stood in the very same column. In the evenings of that fortnight she did the other reckoning, the kind Amos would have respected. She went down the price column with a pencil and totaled 30 years of it, and the whole of it, the Willard tall clock, the Terry, the banjo, all 31, came to a little over $5,000, laid out a few bills at a time by a man whose son moved buildings for a living, and had gone through his father's accounts after the funeral like a man raking a beach, and had found nothing gone. Because nothing was ever gone, it had all been entered, in a gray book, in a cold room, under the heading pieces. She thought about the marriage that had been running quietly alongside the marriage she had known. The Saturdays. The careful cash. The one lie in 11 years, and it had been to guard a gift. She sat by the stove with the 2 clocks going in a beat so close they seemed at times to breathe together, and understood that she had become the only widow she had ever heard of who went looking for her husband's secret life, and found that the secret was her. It made the grief enormous, and it made it warm, and some nights that was the harder thing to carry, and she let it be hard, and kept the clock's wound. The letter was in the case of the Ballard clock, folded small behind the pendulum, in an envelope with one word on the face of it, her name, in his hand. It was dated in September, the same week as the last entry, and it was not long, Amos was not long, on paper any more than aloud. Nell, it began. If you are reading this, then I am stopped, and the will is read, and I expect Ray made his little noise, and I expect you signed it anyway. Because you always did trust me a good deal further than a man who fixes clocks has any right to be trusted. So let me say it once and plainly. They will take the house, and I am sorry for that. But the house was never where I kept you. He told her the rest in half a page, in the flat voice she could hear coming off the paper, how he had stood at the back of the Corliss saleroom in the spring of '86 and bought a stranger's mother's clock because he had heard, From the pharmacist. That the young piano teacher upstairs had lost hers and gone quiet as a stopped house. How he had meant only to mend it and give it back, and had lost his nerve every year for 29 years. Because to give it back, he would have had to say how long he had loved her, and how early it had started, and Amos would sooner have wound the tower with his bare hands. "The children are provided for," the letter said, "and they would have fought me for anything I left you that looked like money. They will never fight a soul for a shop. Pruitt has the wording tight, the shop and each and every item of its contents, of whatever kind and value. That is you, Nell, that is 30 years of you. Keep them, or sell them, or set them in a museum with the maker's names writ large. The ledger tells you what each one is and whose it was. Every clock in that room reminded me that time was worth the keeping, because you were somewhere in it. That was the whole of my method. It was signed the way he signed the Christmas tags, no closing word, only the one initial, A, and beneath it, cramped into the last of the paper as though he had nearly run out of room for the thing he had waited a lifetime to set down, you were never the second wife. You were the clock I set the rest of them by. For 9 days she told no one. It was not strategy. Whatever the family said of it afterward, it was more like the held silence after a chord, when the room decides whether to breathe. She kept her mornings, and every evening sat in the back room with the ledger and one clock at a time, reading the names. The Corlisses, the Pease boy, the grammar school children, grandparents now, whose lessons the regulator had counted. It came to her, somewhere in those days, that she was one of very few people left alive who knew these clocks and these small histories had ever existed, and that whatever she did next she must not do carelessly. It came to her more slowly that she was very likely not poor anymore, though the idea did not land where poverty had lived in her. She wrote, in her own hand, on the first clean line of the ledger, the date and one line, all 31 wound and running. The Ballard clock keeps the best time in the room, and on the 10th day she telephoned the one member of Amos Harmon's family who had ever carried a piano bench like a child, and said, "Robin, I need you to come down to the shop and bring that good camera of yours, and don't tell your father yet." Robin stood in the back room a long time without speaking, which for Robin was very nearly a clinical event. She went down the wall of clocks twice, hands clasped behind her like a girl in a museum who has been told not to touch, and when she finally spoke it, was to ask whether that date on the open page meant what she thought it meant. Then Nell put the ledger in her hands and watched her meet her grandfather. The real one, the one none of them had known, was living in the house with them all those years, page by page, and watched her reach number 31, the metronome, and put her hand over her mouth, because she had heard the story of the pharmacy room and the open window a dozen times, and never once suspected there was a clock at the end of it. Robin cried the way her generation cries, laughing at herself with the tears running, and then became, all at once, extremely 28. This needed documenting. This needed an expert yesterday. And did Nell have the first idea what a documented early Connecticut tall clock brought at auction? Nell said she had some idea. But she let the girl run on, because the sound of one single member of that family being glad on her account was a thing she had not heard in so long that she wanted to stand in it a while, the way you stand in the first warm rain after a hard winter. They photographed all 31 over a weekend, clock by clock, ledger page by ledger page, Nell giving the facts and Robin supplying the adjectives, and sent it off to the Horological Museum 2 towns over in Bristol, whose name Nell had only ever seen on the spine of a library book and the back of a raffle ticket. The answer came in 5 hours, on a Sunday, which Robin said meant everything. A curator named Dr. Cora Bain wrote that the photographs were either a very careful hoax or the most important private find of American clocks she had seen in 30 years in the field, and that either way she would like to drive over on Wednesday, and might she bring a conservator and a timing machine. She came in a small car with a large young assistant and a loop on a cord around her neck. A spare, upright woman somewhere past 60 who shook Nell's hand and then looked at the shop the way Nell had taught herself to look at it over the winter. Not down the lane at the ruin of it, but up, toward the sound of the town clock on the hill. What went on at the long table over the next 6 hours had the shape of a church service. Long silences, sudden low words. At the Willard School tall clock, Dr. Ben stopped speaking altogether for the better part of 5 minutes. At the schoolhouse regulator, she set her timing machine to its beat, listened through the earpiece with her eyes shut, and said, half to herself, that it had not been this near to true since the day it hung in the grammar building, and that whoever had said it had loved it. But it was the ledger that undid her, the way it had undone Nell. She had saved it for last, half out of shyness, for it was after all a family thing, a love letter 30 years long, and when Dr. Bain understood what she was holding, she sat down on the shop stool without troubling to check it first. Provenance, she explained to Robin, who was filming everything, was the whole game and the missing half of the trade. The country was full of orphaned clocks, beautiful and mute, their makers and households erased. What was almost never seen was not the clock, but the record, and here was a collection in which every piece carried a date, a place, a price, a maker where one could be found, and a chain of keeping in one steady hand. Collectors pay for the clock, she said. Historians build careers on the paper. This is both, and in 30 years I have never once seen both. As to money, she was a curator and not a sale room. But she would not insult them by being coy. The tall clock alone, documented as this one was, could bring between $40,000 and $60,000 on the right afternoon with the right two bidders in the room. The Terry and the banjo would start contests of their own. The collection entire, with its ledger, was a museum exhibition as it stood, and she was prepared to put that in writing. Then she came to the last handful, the tin alarm clock, the brass handbell, the metronome, checked each against its page, and looked up at Nell with an expression that had nothing professional left in it. And these, she said. Nell said those weren't worth anything. Doctor, Bain looked back down at the page where a stopped man had written "It keeps better time than I do now," and said, quietly, that she would have to disagree, and that with Nell's leave the exhibition would end with them. Before she left that evening, Dr. Bain stood a while in the shop door looking back at the wall of clocks, all of them going now. 31 beats laid one over another into a soft, dense weather of time, and asked the question Nell had been waiting all day for someone to think to ask. What did Nell want? Not what would she take. What did she want? Robin, who had been arguing loudly for a sale room in New York since about noon, went quiet, because it was a real question, and she knew her grandmother by choice well enough to know the answer would not be simple. Nell looked down the long table at 31 pieces of other people's saved time and said she wanted 3 things, and named them in order. She wanted the clock safe, properly kept, insured. Somewhere a burst pipe or one careless hour could not undo 30 years and 2 centuries in an afternoon. She wanted the names read out, the Corlisses and the Pease boy and the grammar school children, the joiner who made the tall clock and was never once signed. Every household the ledger could put a name to, in big letters, the way the letter said. And she wanted enough, only enough to keep the shop standing and the taxes paid, and never again to have to be grateful for a ride home from a lawyer's office. The rest of it, she said, was Amos's joke, and she meant to laugh at it slowly, over years, in no hurry at all. Dr. Ben nodded the way people nod when a thing has been settled rightly, and said the museum could work with all 3, and that in her experience the collectors could smell it on a seller who was not hungry and paid the better for the insult of it. The story got out the way stories get out in a valley town, a conservator's van on Mill Lane, twice, a sexton with a long memory and a stool at the diner counter, a historical society lady sworn to secrecy, and then her sister. By March it had reached the county weekly, which sent a young reporter who wrote it up fairly and could not resist the headline, "Widow Finds Fortune in Firetrap Clock Shop," and the county weekly was online, and online reached Charlotte, and reached the commercial listings desk where Ray kept his mornings, and on the first mild Sunday in April. Ray's truck came down Mill Lane for the first time since the funeral. Nell watched it come from the front room window and put the coffee on, because some habits carry the weight of a whole life. Ray was expansive at the door, hat actually in his hands, full of how about that, and Dad always was a deep one. And Nell let him get all the way to the thing he had driven 3 hours to say, which was that, of course, legally speaking, those clocks were something of a gray area. Weren't they? Dad's personal property, really. Part of the estate proper. And naturally the family would want to see it all handled fairly. The whole of it in the tone of a man doing her a favor she was too old to follow. Nell poured his coffee and said the will read the shop and each and every item of its contents, of whatever kind and value. Ray smiled the closing smile and said that wills could be read a good many ways. Nell said that then she expected they would have it read the one more way, and thanked him for coming, and stood in the door while he backed the truck around, and noticed that her hands were steady. And thought, he doesn't know about the letter. Amos. You even foresaw the coffee. The petition came before the end of the month. Ray and Paula, through a firm in Hartford, asked the probate court to construe the will, to rule that contents meant benches and parts and the fixtures of a repair trade, as any man would naturally mean by the contents of a shop, and could not have been intended to carry a collection of fine antiques worth 6 figures, and, in the alternative, they raised the possibility, delicately, monstrously, that the clocks had been placed in the back room after the will was signed, or even after Amos was in the ground. That last suggestion did what nothing since the funeral had managed to do. It made Nell Harmon angry. Robin offered to testify against her own father before anyone had asked her to. Dr. Bain wrote an affidavit on museum letterhead dating the muslin covers, the oxidation, the decades of settled oil, the very wear on the winding squares. And Silas Pruitt, who had waited 40 years to be interesting, telephoned Nell on a Tuesday evening and told her that Amos had left instructions for exactly this weather, a sealed copy of the letter in the office safe, and Pruitt's own file memorandum, dated 3 years back, in which Amos Harmon had directed the phrase of whatever kind and value into the will. And, when Pruitt had remarked that it was unusual language for a shop, had answered, Pruitt read it off the memo over the telephone, dry as a docket, that the shop holds the only things I own worth a fight, and the words had best hold, because my son reads a will the way he reads a lease. Nell laughed until she had to sit down on the cot. It was the first time she had laughed at something Amos said since October, and, the way things were tending, it would not be the last. The weeks between the petition and the hearing were long, and Nell spent them the way she had spent every hard season of her life, at the keyboard. She had the church's old upright moved down to the front room of the shop over Robin's protests about the damp, and worked through the spring at a box she had never quite had the hands for, and while she practiced, the town made up its mind, counterstool by counterstool, pew by pew. The diner, which in November had let Ray's every cog joke pass without a word, developed a memory. Elias told the tower story to anyone who sat down beside him. The music guild told no stories at all, which in a small town is the loudest thing a group of women can do. Paula telephoned once, in April, a long call that opened with concern for how Nell was managing down there alone by the mill race, and worked its way, by degrees, in Paula's bright administrative voice, around to how families really ought not let a thing like this reach a courtroom, and how surely there was a figure that would make sense to everyone. Nell listened to the whole of it, sitting on the piano bench with the receiver, watching the light move across the faces of the clocks on the wall. Then she said she agreed entirely that it should never have come near a courtroom, and let the silence do its work, and wished Paula a good evening. She was not proud of how much she enjoyed it. She confessed it to the Bach, measure by measure, and the Bach took it in, the way the work had taken in everything else for 60 years, and the mill race ran on under the floor, and the clocks kept the time, and May came. The hearing was set for a bright morning in May, in the probate court on the second floor of the county building, a room with tall windows and a radiator that knocked like a fist. Nell wore the gray dress she had married him in, because it still fit, and because she was finished apologizing for sentiment. She had expected to sit alone with her lawyer, and she did not sit alone in any way that counted. The gallery behind her filled, row by row, with the Music Guild 6 strong, with Elias Frost in a necktie the color of a slate roof, with 2 of the grammar school children now gone gray themselves, come to sit for the clock that had counted their lessons, and with Robin, who took a seat on Nell's side of the aisle in full view of her father, and did not once look away from the front of the room. Ray and Paula sat with their Hartford lawyers and did not turn around. Nell understood, looking at the backs of their necks, that whatever the judge found, something had already been settled in that room, in the seating of it, the way these things are settled in churches and diners and towns, and that it had not been settled their way. The morning went the way Pruitt had promised, because the men who write things down at the time will beat the men who only remember them later. The Hartford lawyers argued that no reasonable tradesman means heirloom antiques when he says the contents of a shop, that the language was boilerplate, that equity could not abide a windfall. Then, Pruitt took the stand, 77 years old with 40 years of Amos Harmon's paper in a banker's box, and read his own memorandum into the record. The phrase the client had asked for, of whatever kind and value, the client's stated reason, the shop holds the only things I own worth a fight. The date, 3 years before Amos died, the same spring, as it happened, that a certain museum in Bristol had no idea it was 3 years from a very good Wednesday. Elias Frost, called for 10 minutes, told the court about 30 years of Monday mornings in the tower. Cash refused, and confirmed that the man who had kept the whole town's time to the second was not a man who lost track of what he owned. Dr. Bain testified to the age of the covers and the decades of settled oil, and took apart the suggestion that anyone had staged the room after the fact with the weary exactness of a woman marking a poor examination. And then, Nell's lawyer read the letter. She read it slowly, into a courtroom gone so still the radiator sounded rude. They will take the house, and I am sorry for that. But the house was never where I kept you, and Nell watched the court reporter's hands, because she could not watch anything else in the room, and when the reading reached the last line, the one about the clock he set the rest of them by, one of the guild women behind her made a small, broken sound, and the judge did not gavel it, and at the far table Paula put her face in her hands, and Nell was surprised to find she took no pleasure in it. Almost none. She was a truthful woman, even about herself. The judge ruled from the bench, which the young lawyer whispered was a rare thing. He said the language of the will was not ambiguous, and that even were it ambiguous, the outside evidence, the memorandum, the tower, the covers, the ledger, and the decedent's own letter settled the maker's intent past any honest doubt. Amos Harmon had known to the ounce what stood in his back room, had chosen his words with care to carry it there, and had trusted the court to read plain English plainly, a trust the court saw no reason to disappoint. The petition was denied. Costs to the petitioners. He was quiet a moment, and then, in the voice a judge keeps for the one human sentence he permits himself, he said that in 28 years on the bench he had construed a great many wills, and that this was the first he had ever read that was also, so far as he could tell, a love letter with a legal description, and he wished the widow joy of her marriage. The gallery did not cheer, because the guild does not cheer, but 6 gray heads turned toward Nell at the same moment, which came to the same thing. In the corridor afterward, Ray came at her sideways through the crowd, and his face was working at something, and what finally came out of it was that he had not known his father had it in him. Nell looked a long moment at her husband's son, and found she had no wish left to wound him, which was a verdict of its own. He had it in him the whole time, she said. You only ever stood in the front room. And she shook his hand, because Amos would have wanted it done, and went down the courthouse stairs into the May light with the guild around her like an honor guard. The exhibition opened in Bristol that autumn, a year almost to the day from the funeral, in 3 low-lit rooms with the clocks going softly all at once. Dr. Bain had fought her own board over the title and won, so the banner over the door said what the ledger was. The Widow's Ledger. 30 years of rescued American clocks. The ledger itself lay first, open under glass, to the page for number 1, the Ballard Mantel Clock. And the wall text told the story straight, because no curator could improve on it. The great clocks stood along the first 2 rooms with their makers' names and their households' names in large letters, exactly as the letter had ordered. The Willard School joiner, unsigned, named at last on his card as the maker of this clock, whose name is not known, whose year of evenings is. Scholars came, and school groups, and clock people by the busload from 4 states. And the last room, the small one, held 3 humble machines of no market value at all. A tin alarm clock, a brass handbell, a mahogany metronome, each with its ledger page enlarged on the wall above it, and the museum's own count showed what Dr. Bain had known it would. People walked briskly enough past $60,000 of tall clock and stood the longest, and went the quietest, in the room that had cost, all told, about $1. Nell sold nothing that first year but a single plain kitchen clock with no name to protect, and the check reslated the shop roof, which a local man did at cost, for the story of it. The rest she loaned, on the one condition that the names stayed large. She was not rich the way the county weekly had promised. She was something the weekly had no column to print. She stayed at the shop. Ray's lawyers, in the summer, sent a stiff, careful letter offering to sell her the house on Chapel Street at appraisal, and she declined, by return post, with real thanks, because the offer meant Robin was working on him. But the truth was, the house had never been where Amos kept her either, and she knew now where she lived. She kept the shop, and she kept it running, set a bell over the door and a card in the window, Ballard and Harmon, clocks, though there had been no Ballard in the trade before her and there would be none after, and took in the town's stop time 1 piece at a time, and taught Robin on second Saturdays how to let a mainspring down without losing a finger. The Music Guild moved its Tuesdays to the front room, 6 women and the old upright under a wall of clocks, all keeping the same slow hour, and now and then a young person came down Mill Lane who wanted to know how a thing that had stopped could be made to go again, and Nell showed them, because Amos's ledger had always been very clear about what things were for. And on a winter evening at the shop, with the stove ticking and her mother's clock keeping the best time in the room, Nell put on her reading glasses, opened the gray book to the first clean line, and wrote in her own steady hand, number 32. Ballard Mantel Clock, Rosewood, 8 day. Home, wound this evening, and every evening, by the one it was kept for. Not for sale, not now, not ever, and this time the whole town knows what it is worth. She looked at the page a while. Then she added the last line, the one the whole book had been waiting on, and closed the cover over it, kept at the shop. Still keeping her time. Thank you for staying to the end of Nell's story. Stories like this one only keep their time when someone stays for the whole slow length of them, the way Amos stayed, and the way you just did. Now it is your turn to add a line to the ledger. Somewhere in your life there was a person like him, Someone whose love did its quiet work out of sight, in a workshop, or a garden, or a savings book, or a tower. Someone you did not fully read until the years let the light come in sideways. Tell us about them in the comments. Tell us their name and the quiet thing they did, because a name written down is a name kept. And this channel is, in the end, a ledger too, and we read every entry. If this story earned it, share it with one person who needs reminding that being overlooked is not the same as being unloved. And if you would like more stories of the ones a family wrote off opening the one door nobody thought to check, subscribe to The Widow's Ledger and tap the bell so the next one finds you. Until then, look after the quiet ones. And every so often, wind the clock.